Hello and welcome to a special edition of Chopper's Brexit Podcast. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and I'm here, still in a Red Lion pub at my usual table, reflecting on what might come from a Boris Johnson premiership. Well, it's day one of Boris Johnson's leadership of the Conservative Party, and later on this afternoon, he'll be going to Buckingham Palace for a cup of tea with the Queen, who will invite him to form a government. And that comes after he defeated Jeremy Hunt in the Conservative Party's interminable leadership campaign. So today, I'm bringing you a bonus episode of Chopper's Brexit Podcast, in which I'm hoping to dig a bit deeper into what sort of PM Boris Johnson might be. And to help me answer that question, I'm joined by a man who made it his job to find out what makes our new Prime Minister tick. Andrew Gimson is the author of Boris, The Rise of Boris Johnson. He's also a former colleague of Boris Johnson at the Telegraph, and therefore former colleague of mine at the Telegraph. He's also worked with Boris Johnson when Boris was the editor of the Spectator magazine. This is Boris Johnson by the man who knows him best. Andrew Gimson, my old mate for the Telegraph, welcome to Chopper's Brexit Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, in my hand, I've got a copy of the book, which you very kindly ascribed to my wife. It's called Boris, The Adventures of Boris Johnson.
Yes.
Now, the first edition copy, which I also have, was The Rise of Boris. Why have you changed it from Rise to Adventures?
Well, ridiculously, we changed the title, and it's confused matters. It's essentially the same book with additional stuff about how he led the referendum to success, became for a few days the front runner in the Tory leadership contest in 2016, and then Michael Gove said he wasn't fit to be Prime Minister, and he dramatically withdrew. And then, almost as dramatically, and to the great shock of many people, including Gove, he became Foreign Secretary. I think Rise would have covered that. We thought maybe the rise and fall, then the rise and fall and rise. But in fact, we were trying to be too sort of clever about it. We should just have stuck with the same old title, The Rise of Boris Johnson, which now that he has actually risen quite spectacularly.
He is risen indeed, as at Easter. I mean, he really is risen. I mean, crumbs.
Well, hang on. Don't let's drag...
He's not Jesus Christ.
No, he's not. And actually, he's not really. He's really a man of the ancient world. He's a pre-Christian figure, I would say.
Yes. Which figure would you liken him to?
Well, he likens himself to Pericles, which is who made Athens the greatest city and a model for...
And who was Pericles, for readers who don't, or listeners who don't
Pericles was the leader of ancient Athens, got them involved in a terrible war, actually. And then died.
Okay.
But
that's a bad omen.
But nevertheless, a great hero and gave great speeches and all that sort of thing. And this idea of, when he was mayor of London, he wanted London to be the greatest city in the world, and that it's difficult to argue with that, to say no, let's be the sort of 53rd greatest. And now, as Prime Minister, he will want this country to be the greatest in the world, which is not exactly a political thing. It's very, very difficult for Labour to oppose that aspiration.
Yes. How many editions of your book have you done? You've done 2 or 3 now, haven't you?
I've slightly lost track. I think it's more like 4 or 5.
4 or 5. Because I was there when I joined the lobby team at the Telegraph. You were in the corner, just effing and blinding and finding it jolly hard work writing the first edition of this book, weren't you?
Boris got very cold feet about it. To begin with, he was tremendously keen and really, he sort of went into Victorian statesman mode, and he said he would put his papers at my full disposal. And I knew that if I was lucky, that would mean a couple of unpaid parking tickets. But nevertheless, he gave me his mother's phone number, his father's phone number, his sister's phone number. He invited me to his 40th birthday party. So this was 15 years ago. Then he started to get very cold feet, and he became worried that I might begin to tell the truth about him. And he said nothing could be more damaging than a book which told the truth about him. And I said, actually, Boris, I think it'd be much better if there's any embarrassing bits in your life story to get these bits out in the open now, before you're Prime Minister, well before you're Prime Minister, rather than later on. And it's almost always, of course, the cover-up that damages people. He didn't really take that argument, and he asked me how much money I was being paid to do the book. I was, of course, being paid a pitiful sum, probably about a quarter of what Boris would get paid to give one speech to sort of the Association of Actuaries or something. So I wouldn't tell him how much I was being paid. And he then started trying to buy me out, to pay me not to do the book. And eventually, he offered me £100,000 not to do the book. And then he realised I'm the kind of narrow-minded Englishman who gets quite sort of huffy at the idea that I could be bought. So then he tried a different tack. He offered free Greek lessons for my children.
So you turned down £100,000 to write this book.
Whether I would have seen the £100,000, I have no idea. But he was very keen that I should not do the book. Although I think he subsequently realised that, although I think if you read the book, you can assemble all the material you would need were you to wish to do a damning portrait of Boris. The book is actually more charitable in tone than the...
You have lots of family pictures in there. I assume they came from the family.
Stanley, his father, kindly provided some of them, and various other members of the family also provided pictures, yes.
In your book, what were the first signs, do you think, of Boris Johnson's fearless ambition?
Well, his sister Rachel told me that as a small child he wanted to be world king.
World king?
World king, yes. And so that was... And I saw the first, or what is undoubtedly one of his first literary efforts, which was painted rather neatly on the side of the room on Exmoor, sort of a rather...
In his house
It's a rather fine wooden shed outside the house where they were living, which was fitted up as a playroom at that point for the children. Rains a lot on Exmoor. And he painted on the wall of this shed, rather a fine shed, "Boo to grown-ups."
Boo to grown-ups.
Which remains in many ways a sort of key plank in his manifesto.
That's a good metaphor for life, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, yes.
I like boo to grown-ups.
Yes.
And he started out in journalism. There's a row at the Times about allegedly fabricating quotes.
He did fabricate a quote.
Oh, he did, okay.
But he the bit of the traineeship he was doing on the Times, you had to rewrite agency copy. And if you could add a couple of original quotes to it, then you could put your byline on it.
Yes.
So there was incentive to try and get something extra beyond what the agency had sent over. He wanted to get something extra about a palace belonging to Edward II, which had been excavated on the south bank of the Thames. He rang up his godfather, who was an expert on French 18th century history, so not really the right person. Couldn't get through to him, and then made up what he thought his godfather would be perfectly happy to say. And in fact, what he made up was completely wrong. I mean, it made his godfather look a complete laughingstock, and his godfather intended to have a successful academic career, and did indeed become Master of Balliol College, Oxford in due course, did very well, but was really furious because he knew that every scholar in the land who read the Times at breakfast would be laughing at him for these completely ludicrous comments he made about Edward II. So he was very cross. Boris was unrepentant, and I was told he actually said to the editor of the Times, "But aren't all the quotes in your paper made up?" And the editor of the Times, a chap called Charlie Wilson, who Boris described as being like someone out of a Brit flick gangster movie, he was very, very angry with this gilded youth from Oxford who thought you could just go around behaving like that.
Do you think that entitlement that you're seeing in those quotes to the editor of the Times, aren't all your quotes made up, is part of his problem? I mean, he went to Eton, he went to Oxford, I mean, the man has... Well, I didn't think... Has he faced any hardship or difficulty?
You call it a problem. I think it's a very good thing to have gone to a good school.
Yeah,
I think
I'm just challenging. I'm not saying I agree with that.
I know you're challenging, but I know it's a widespread assumption that it's a drawback to have gone to a good school. I think it's a very good thing.
It's because David Cameron seemed to spend all his time apologising for it, I suppose, and he was the most famous old Etonian we've had in public life in the past 20 years.
Cameron played it in a completely different way, and the photographs of the Bullingdon Club mysteriously vanished, presumably thanks to some rich benefactor buying them up. Whereas Boris, of course, if someone refers to him having been a member of the Bullingdon Club, he starts banging the desk and then going buller, buller, buller. And he did this to Dimbleby, didn't he, when he was on one of Dimbleby's programmes? So Dimbleby, of course, who not probably virtually no one knew this, had also been a member of the Bullingdon Club.
Had he?
Yeah.
And when did you first meet Boris Johnson, Andrew Gimson?
I met Boris in 1987. He was still at Oxford. I met his then girlfriend, Allegra Mostyn Owen, at the house of a very remarkable woman, now dead, called Elizabeth Furze, who gave dinners almost every night in her basement flat in a very, very bohemian way. She was from Berlin originally, and she sort of introduced Englishmen in particular. On the whole, she preferred men to women, to the sort of charms of Central Europe. And had run a thing called the Bistro off Sloane Square, where lots of young...
She wasn't a student then? She
was an elderly lady.
Oh,
I met Allegra there. She said, "Will you..." And I was working for the Spectator. She said, will you talk to my boyfriend? He wants to get into journalism. I said, yeah, of course I will. So Boris came round and had dinner with me, and I made a few suggestions about who he should go and talk to. But in fact, he was already talking to far more important people than me, and he left each of us with the heartwarming impression that we were solely responsible for launching him as a journalist, whereas the truth was, of course, that he launched and then relaunched himself. He was bloody good at it.
Yeah. And after the Times, he went on to the Spectator magazine, didn't he?
Well, he went on to the Telegraph.
The Telegraph, then the Spectator.
Yes.
So you
Max Hastings, though, gave him his second chance after he'd been sacked by the Times, so that was very important. And then Max gave him this big thing to going to Brussels, a town that Boris already knew from having lived there as a child, and that was where Boris made his first reputation as a journalist.
Yes, and what was that? What was that like? There were stories about bananas being straightened by Brussels rules.
Everyone else, most of the other correspondents, estimable people like Charles Grant, who was there, I think, for The Economist, but they were all estimable, serious-minded correspondents who knew a lot about the European Union, and who treated the whole project with a degree of respect. And Boris saw that there was a great deal of mileage to be made from mocking these people who wanted to impinge upon our national sovereignty. And of course, it was a very big domestic story because Margaret Thatcher was resisting this. Her colleagues, such as Geoffrey Howe, thought that we should, on the whole,
so what year are we talking about?
He went to Brussels in 1989.
Right.
Thatcher fell at the end of 1990. So it was a very big domestic story. And Max Hastings got lots of complaints from people like Douglas Hurd, sort of Europhile Tory ministers, saying, look, this man's causing us a lot of trouble, can't you send him somewhere else?
And Max didn't?
Max didn't.
To his credit?
To his credit, he didn't. No.
Even though,
even when there was a big row about the Guppy tape, Max stood by him. The Guppy tape is a bizarre thing. Darius Guppy was a friend of Boris's at school and particularly at Oxford. Darius, unfortunately, not only committed an insurance fraud, but was totally unrepentant about it, which was very bad. But before, I think, he'd been found out, he'd fallen out with one of his accomplices who thought that he was getting far too small a share of the spoils, and who therefore made a tape recording of a conversation between Darius Guppy and Boris Johnson. And Darius was being... a journalist was taking an interest in what he'd been up to, and he wanted to go and beat this journalist up, and he wanted Boris to get the address. And Boris said he would, but never did. And I've listened to that tape. Much of it is about the generals of the Second World War, which of them were the best.
Yes.
And that goes on for a very long time, and there's also a bit about Napoleon in it. It's a sort of rather mad conversation, and Boris's defence was that he was humouring his friend, but of course did not supply
the
address of the
you buy his argument? Do you think Boris wanted to get the guy beaten up?
I do. I think most of us. Well, first of all, I don't think you can select. If you're going to have a circle of friends, all of whom are of irreproachable morals, you're going to have a very small circle of friends. And secondly, I think most of us, if our telephone conversations were recorded, some of them would look. Sort of when reproduced in print, they would look pretty disreputable.
After the Telegraph, he went on to become editor of The Spectator, where you were his employee for a bit.
Well, yes,
it's
a funny thing. I had been deputy editor of The Spectator, then I went to Berlin for the Telegraph, and then I came back, and Boris invited me to be foreign editor, but the joke was... I was paid reasonably well for those pieces I wrote for the paper, but my only duty was to go to the Thursday morning editorial conference to think about next week's magazine. I did no editing, and I never went abroad. And Boris thought this was very funny.
What was he like as a boss?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I've never known more freedom in editorial conferences.
So he trusted his colleagues.
You could tell any joke. Well, the Stuart Reid was there, who's absolutely wonderful deputy editor, seeing the copy through. And a very amusing and charming and a very good journalist and very experienced journalist. So he was doing the detail, and so were various other
So he relied on lieutenants to do the job for him, and that may be what you see in number 10.
Well, it's what he did at City Hall, and it is obviously what any Prime Minister has to do, however great some individual may be. I'm not saying that Boris is necessarily great at all, but it has to be a team effort, actually. Cabinet government isn't just a nice theory. Unless you use your cabinet ministers, it doesn't work. And one of Theresa May's weaknesses was that she didn't make proper use of the abilities of her cabinet.
Did you ever discuss or talk about his political ambition?
Not much. He does rather tend to keep different parts of his life in separate compartments. He doesn't volunteer sort of needless disclosures about... But it was obvious. I mean, I think he made absolutely no secret that he wanted to go into politics. He fought a seat he wasn't going to win in 97.
Where was that?
That was Clwyd South, I think. He said, I fought Clwyd South, and Clwyd South fought back. He learned how to order fish and chips in Welsh.
Did he? But you called him in your book a lazy workaholic.
Well, that's actually Charles Moore's expression.
He's a former editor of the Telegraph.
Yes, former editor of the Telegraph, who knows Boris well, been Boris's editor, realises Boris's many faults, including filing his copy very late, which in a selfish way, actually, because it made life a misery for the people who had to see it into the paper. But, of course, with a touch of genius and with a great deal of energy. So Boris would take on 20 more times assignments, and he had time to do well.
Yes.
So that's the laziness, not doing things well. But the workaholic bit is actually wanting to do fantastic quantities of work and wanting to do politics as well as editing.
And he would file late, wouldn't he, famously? And
he was always file late, yeah. And he got very angry one night when his column was actually held out.
What do you think of his private life? He's 55 years old. We know, I'm afraid, that he's sleeping on basically the sofa of his girlfriend's flat in South London. I mean, it's quite messy, isn't it? Does that worry you about him?
I think the Conservative Party is deeply, though not very visibly, divided between those who believe that marriage is the foundation of society and those who are sort of Merry England Conservatives.
And where does he sit?
And he's obviously a Merry England Conservative, and he has written about how wonderful the ancient world was before the dawn of Christian guilt, when you could sort of have sex with anyone you wanted without lots of guilty feelings that you were behaving in a moral fashion. And because people know that's his outlook, I think it's politically it's not a disaster. I think also most people know that you do need a private life.
And he's quite clear on not even discussing it, isn't he? His girlfriend's Carrie Symonds, we know that, but he won't talk about, name her.
Yes, well, I think that's right, because he did make a blunder in 2004 when he said that the stories about his affair with Petronella Wyatt were a pyramid of piffle, and they weren't. Then the press could set out to prove that he was a liar.
He has been undone over the years on what he's been saying. I mean, do you think he's been unfairly traduced, maybe as Foreign Secretary? Was the system out there behind me where the Foreign Office is, were they try out to get him, do you think?
Well, I think there's obviously, if you're a politician in a free country, people can traduce you or attack you or probe your weaknesses. He ought to be. That sort of thing ought to happen. And he's actually, I think one thing people like about his rise to Downing Street now is that he's been made to work for it. He was spoken of in 2003, 2004 as perhaps the next Tory Prime Minister. Then he had various...
By whom?
Well, by all sorts of commentators thought that he was maybe the person the Tories needed, having by then not won an election for 12 years. He didn't get it. In fact, he was discredited by various scandals at the end of 2004. David Cameron came in, got it, and he realised he wasn't going to get anywhere under Cameron. So
why was that? Because Cameron didn't trust him?
Cameron didn't trust him. The last thing we wanted was an old Etonian loose cannon who completely incapable of behaving as of subsuming his own personality and just being an invisible.
And since then, Boris's ambition to be PM has dominated British politics. I remember that Michael Cockerell interview when he talked about the ball becoming free at the back of the scrum, and that became a huge thing at the time, didn't it?
It did. He's very generous.
In 2012 or so, or 2011?
Well, Boris is very... I mean, you could say he's generous to his old trade. He provides amazing quantities of copy, and people are always interested, but most people thought he was out of it, and that was my assumption, and he wasn't.
And even when he had to go and apologise to Liverpool for a clumsily written leader in the Spectator magazine about the numbers who died in Hillsborough.
Yes.
He kind of, it was a very, very serious issue at the time, but it kind of just became part of the Boris show, didn't it? Yes,
it led, it sort of set up his sacking from the Tory front bench, Michael Howard, about a month after that.
Because he's education spokesman, wasn't he?
He wasn't, no, it was arts, shadow arts and culture and media and sport. And he got sacked from that. So in the short term, it damaged him, actually. I mean, it damaged his political career, and he had to go off and be Mayor of London because he couldn't get anywhere at Westminster.
Or up north. Because he couldn't. He was not trusted in Liverpool, wasn't he? After that. How many Tories are trusted?
I think he gets on fine with Liverpudlians now, actually. And of course, a lot of the indignation was not by Liverpudlians; it was by people in London who thought that the Liverpudlians would be very cross about it.
Do you think he can master the brief? Now, that David Cameron told me once that he loved the idea that the PMQ, the discipline of PMQs, 45 minutes every Wednesday of being asked anything about the government, meant he had to learn everything about the government to go into that period. Do you think Boris Johnson has the discipline to do that, to be prepared, to know what's going to happen across all of government so I can answer any question I'm asked?
I think when he realises that he needs to do it, and to some extent he's learnt from his errors, and he does have a very good memory, so I think he can do that. Where he's weak is that he's not spent anything like enough time in the Commons chamber to become a good parliamentarian, and the tone of voice you need in the House of Commons is quite different to what you need to make 1,500 loyal Conservatives feel good about being Conservative at a meeting at the party conference. And this much more conversational tone, where you're not just sort of demonstrating what a great and amusing speaker you are, where you're actually discussing in an almost conversational tone the serious questions of policy. He hasn't yet. I mean, he'll now have an immersion course because as Prime Minister, he'll have to be at the dispatch box a lot. So,
well, he's back in early September as the first appearance.
Exactly, yes.
When he was on the front bench of the Tories in the mid-noughties, I thought he was a very poor spokesman. I thought he wasn't very good and, in fact, rather disappointing.
He took the university's brief more seriously than he'd taken the culture brief. And I think did some quite serious stuff about higher education. But he didn't. Then Gove got promoted when there was a reshuffle in 2007. Gove, who'd only got into Parliament in 2005. He got the key thing of facing up to Ed Balls, who was the new Prime Minister's henchman. And Boris was left outside the shadow cabinet. And I think at that point realised that it might be better to go off and fight Ken Livingstone.
Yes, which was a heck of a challenge. And he won.
A challenge, yeah.
Do you think, I mean, in all the hustings, he talked about Boris the Mayor a lot and not about Boris the Foreign Secretary. Yes. Now, why is that?
Well, I think, obviously, he didn't burnish his reputation as Foreign Secretary, and I think that was partly his fault, but also partly the Prime Minister's fault. Successful Foreign Secretaries fly to important conferences with the Prime Minister. Lord Carrington and Margaret Thatcher, further back, Disraeli and Lord Salisbury at the Congress of Berlin in 1878.
Yes, I remember it well.
You have to do it. Great story. And basically, he was given this he was in a gilded cage, which is not and he's not really, he's not the kind of songbird that flutters at all happily about.
Enemies all around, people hating Brexit, no
and
advisors.
Obviously not taking, he obviously did annoy some of the senior people at the Foreign Office. Some of the junior people who worked closely with him thought he was very good.
Have you talked to them a bit for your book, have you?
Yeah.
What was the most surprising thing you discovered about Boris Johnson, given you've known him for, 30, 40 years? What was the most surprising thing you learnt in your book about him?
I think one of the key things about him is that, unlike most Englishmen, and I think also unlike most Italians, he likes having a go at things he's no good at. So it isn't just effortless superiority. And, I mean, I didn't experience this myself, but at school, someone won the piano prize, the piano competition at Eton, and the best pianists were very, very good. There were 1,200 boys in the school, and included some very good musicians. And he thought that if he took up the piano, he could win it next year. But in fact, he was unusually bad at the piano and had enormous difficulty even getting to grade 1. He found it very difficult to coordinate his fingers with his brain or something. And yet he kept going. And the usual thing would have been to pay for the lessons but not bother to do any practice. But he practiced enormously outside the housemaster's study, as it happened. So the housemaster
heard him.
A great man who wrote amazing school reports about Boris. A great man, and he shared the agony of... Yeah.
God, and did he win the...
Martin Hammond.
He didn't win the competition.
No, he couldn't. Obviously, the competition...
He came last, despite all the effort.
You couldn't even go in for the competition, because if you're struggling towards grade 1, you're not of a satisfactory calibre. And
just finally, Andrew, how do you think we'll look back on the Boris Johnson Premiership in 10 years' time? And Lord knows how long it lasts for. But let's fast forward.
I haven't the faintest idea. It may be a triumph or a disaster or a mixture of the two. Prime Ministers usually end up being blamed for something, but I think one of the big advantages he has as he goes into number 10 is that his abilities are underestimated by a considerable number of pundits who think that his whole style of politics is simply not serious.
And can he unite the country?
Well, I think
Or is it not even worth bothering?
I think he will certainly try to. He'll certainly want to, and I think his ability to connect with the wider public is certainly one of the strongest card in his hand, probably.
Andrew Gimson, author of The Adventures of Boris Johnson. Thank you for coming on Chopper's Brexit Podcast, this special edition. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Andrew's book, The Adventures of Boris Johnson, is available at all good bookshops. Thank you to this week's podcast producers, Theo Laludis and Elliot Lampitt. And thank you for listening to this podcast. If you're enjoying it, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and maybe even a 5-star rating. And thank you to Nickname Already Taken and Samito for doing so recently. Don't forget, you can get 30 days free access to Telegraph's online coverage at telegraph.co.uk/chopper. And if you want to get in touch, send us a message on Twitter at Brexit Broadcast or email us choppersbrexitpodcast@telegraph.co.uk. And always buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. Until next time, cheerio!